Good morning and welcome to this latest webinar from Eurostat on the subject of gender statistics. I'm Tim Allen from the Dissemination Unit. I'm moderating this morning's session and we have a number of my colleagues here to present two subjects in particular, the gender employment gap and the gender pay gap. I'll introduce them as we go to each presentation, but I'd like to start with a couple of announcements. We are recording this morning's webinar and we will make the recording available shortly after the webinar. So if you miss some of the event, you'll still have a chance to catch up. Secondly, we're interacting Q&A session via Slido. There's a Slido QR code visible on screen and visible on our website, and also, if you prefer, there's the Slido event number 716422. So you can pose your questions via Slido. We'll collect them together and put them to our panel at the end. Okay, so I'd like to start by introducing Christine Verts, who is our Director of Social Statistics, who'll say a few words of welcome. Christine.
Good morning and warm welcome to everybody to this Eurostat webinar on gender statistics. And the reason is to mark the occasion of tomorrow's International Women's Day. Comparing the situation of women and men is relevant in several policy domains and needed for evidence-based policy making. We have specific indicators giving synthesized information on women and men, and those are mostly called gender statistics. We at Eurostat have a long tradition of breaking down the social statistics by sex, that is showing the statistics not only for the total population, but also for women and men, whenever relevant, for example, in the domains of education, social inclusion, and childcare. Today, as Tim already said, we will focus on two indicators in the domain of the labor market, the gender employment gap and the gender pay gap. In the social scoreboard for the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, both these indicators are headline indicators for the strand on equal opportunities. And also at a global level, the monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender equality uses these indicators on the labor market. But it includes also other gender statistics, to name just the gender gap for early leavers from education and training, the gender gap for tertiary education attainment, and also the gender pay gap, the gender gap for people not participating actively in the labor market due to caring responsibilities. But we also look a bit deeper in the situation. We look at the younger and the older, women and men, or how the situation is for women and men with lower or higher education, or even on the women and men that were born in the country where they currently live, or that were born outside. Indeed, it's a complex reality, and measuring this in statistical terms is complex. So for today, let us now look at the situation of the gender employment gap, and they are also looking at various factors like the level of education or whether or not children are part of the household. But also we have country-specific factors that will be illustrated during the presentations. Also, we are going to hear about the gender pay gap, and it's not sufficient to analyze the discrimination for equal pay and work, or the value of equal work. So we will look into aspects that go a bit deeper there. This webinar will present in greater detail the obstacles women face in the labor market. And after the presentations by my colleagues, we will be happy to answer questions, and I hope these presentations are informative for you. And so far from me, and back to Tim.
Thank you, Christine. And now we move on to our first presentation, which is Genevieve Villette, who is a statistical officer working on the labour force survey methodology and analysis. And Genevieve will be presenting some findings on the gender employment gap. Over to you, Genevieve.
Thank you very much. So good morning and thank you again for joining us. In this presentation, I would like to show you the key differences between the employment of men and women. We will see together the most influential characteristics. So let's move on to the first slide and start from the very beginning. So if we compare the employment rate of men and women, we can see that the employment rate of men is higher than the employment rate of women in all EU member states. In the European Union, 78% of men are employed, but this share is much lower among women as there are only 67% who are employed, which gives a gender employment gap of 11 points of percentage. We can also see that the difference varies a lot from a country to another, but there is a general pattern. The lower the employment rate of women, the wider the gender employment gap. So let's go directly to the next slide to focus on the gap. Then when we look closer at the gender employment gap in 2020, the widest gaps are reported by Italy, Romania, Greece, Malta, Hungary, Poland, and Czechia. All those countries record more than 15 points of percentage between the share of employed men and women. And on the other hand, the difference does not exceed 5 points of percentage in Sweden, Latvia, Finland, and Lithuania. And in the next figure, I will present the long-term development of the gap. So this figure shows the evolution over the last 18 years for the EU. So we can see a downward trend. The gender employment gap narrows from almost 18 points of percentage in 2002 to 11 points of percentage in 2020 in the EU. And my next slide shows the situation by country. As we can notice on this figure, the change we have just observed for the EU is not reflected in all countries. The gap decreases by more than 15 points of percentage in Malta, Luxembourg, and Spain, but it increases in Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Sweden. And on the next slides, I will show the factors affecting the employment of men and women to better understand these differences. So, if we focus on the employment of men and women aged between 25 and 54 by level of education, we clearly see that the higher the level of education, the narrower the gender employment gap. And the difference between the share of employed men and women is almost 4 times larger for those with a low level of education than for those with a high level of education. And now let's see what happens for people with and without children. So the presence of children in the household seems to play a key role in the share of employed men and women. In the EU, 90% of men with children are employed, but only 81% of men without children are employed. And among women, this is clearly the opposite. Women without children are more likely to be employed than women with children. So the presence of children seems to negatively impact the employment of women, but at the same time, it positively and significantly impacts the employment of men. So let's move on to the next slide that focuses on the gender employment gap according to the presence of children. So if we only consider the gender employment gap of people with children, so you can refer to the red bars in the figure, we can see that the difference goes from 7 points of percentage in Lithuania to more than 20 points of percentage in Italy, Greece, Hungary, Czechia, Malta, Romania, Slovakia, and Ireland. However, if we consider the difference among men and women without children, so you can refer to the green bars here, we can see that it gives a different picture. The employment gap amounted to less than 3 points of percentage is in slightly more than 2/3 of the 27 member states. Another finding that is really interesting is that some countries show a very large difference in the gender employment gap according to the presence or to the absence of children. For example, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, and Ireland have one of the widest employment gaps between men and women with children, but one of the narrowest gaps among men and women without children. And in the next figure, we combine both characteristics, presence of children and education, to see how large can be the difference. So when we cross the level of education with the number of children, we can clearly see that the gender differences are more or less pronounced according to the specific characteristics. For example, if we have a look at the first bar, the gender employment gap of people without children, which is 13 points of percentage for people with a low level of education, while it only amounts to 2 points of percentage for people with a high level of education. The gender employment gap is higher for people with children for all levels of education and increases to a larger extent for people with a lower level of education. We also find the lowest employment rates among women with 3 or more children and among those with at least one child aged less than 6 years. And this pattern is true for each level of education. And on the next slide, I will present the pattern for the EU and some member states. So to the question, do all countries show the same difference by level of education and presence of children? The answer is that a pattern clearly exists. First, the gender employment gap between men and women with children, so in red in the figure, varies, but it is substantial in all countries for each level of education. And it is really important to remind that the gap among men and women with children is caused not only by a lower employment rate for women, but also by a higher employment rate for men. Secondly, the lower the level of education, the wider the gap regardless the presence of children. And the following and last figure includes all EU member states, so we can easily look at the general pattern. And another thing I really would like to share today with you is about the part-time employment. The presence of children increases the part-time employment for women and decreases the part-time employment for men. And if we compare the women with and without children, the part-time employment increases more for those with a higher level of education. For men, it is once again the opposite. And this statement is further explained in the news item Gender Employment Gap Larger for Parents that has just been released this morning. So let's move on to the last slide to see where to find further information. So if you want to know more about the gender differences, you can refer to our main publication, Labour Market in the Light of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Quarterly Statistics, or to the Eurostat database for extracting the data. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Genevieve. I will remind you before we move on to the next presentation, I'll remind you that if you've got any questions, you can pose them in Slido and we'll be keeping them, we'll be compiling them together for the Q&A at the end. But now we'll move on to our second presentation. So we have Denis Letienne, who is a team leader in working on labour market statistics on businesses, and Marina Perez-Julian, who is the statistical officer working on labour market statistics, and they're going to talk about the gender pay gap. So over to you, Denis and Marina.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone. I feel very happy to present you the gender pay gaps in the EU that will help us better address gender policies. So let's start from the beginning. The first slide. Tackling possible discrimination in earnings between men and women is one of the key priorities of gender policies at both EU and national levels. The right of both women and men to equal pay for equal work belongs to the European Pillar of Social Rights. The unadjusted gender pay gap is included in the scoreboard of indicators used for monitoring the action plan of the Commission and is the leading indicator to evaluate progress in the reduction of the pay gap. The indicator is calculated as shown here, the relative difference between the average gross hourly earnings of women and men. It is very simple, but it has its limitations that we can see in the next slide. Although the indicator gives an overall picture in the difference in pay between men and women, it does not capture discrimination as such in the sense of equal pay for equal work, because it measures a broader concept. Why? Because it struggles with this composition effect. For instance, men and women may work in different occupations and sectors of the economy, which is known as gender segregation. So what can we do to better understand the gender pay gap? Let's see. We applied a consolidating methodology that enables to decompose the different components of the gap. First, we have the part explained by the different average characteristics of male versus female employees, and the remaining one, what we call the unexplained part, where, among others, is due to gender differences in returns for the same average characteristics for men and women. Let's see now in the next slide what we found. So if we look at the unadjusted gender pay gap, the black lines split into the explained by the different characteristics, the bars in blue, and the unexplained part, the bars in orange, we can see that at EU level, the explained part represents 3.1 percentage points. This means that women are expected to earn 3.1% less than men according to their average characteristics on the labor market, which are less remunerative than those of males. As a result, against the 14.4% of the unadjusted gender pay gap, we moved to an 11.2% of unexplained gender pay gap. That means that on average, after correcting for the different characteristics, women still earn 11.2% less than men. This is a rather limited adjustment due to the fact that countries record positive or negative adjustments that partly cancel each other out at EU level. In the next slide, we can see some countries with positive adjustments that correct the gender pay gap downwards, meaning that female employees present average characteristics on the labor market that are less remunerative than those of men. For some countries, such as Austria and Germany, the explained gender pay gap constitutes nearly half of the unadjusted. In the case of Belgium, the unadjusted is fully explained by composition or segregation effects captured by the gender pay gap adjustment. In the next slide, we can see those 12 countries that have negative explained gender pay gap, meaning that female employees present average characteristics on the labor market that are more remunerative than those of men. This is the case in particular for countries where women with lower education and skills refrain from entering in the labor market. They don't engage, especially when there are few job opportunities, what we call the self-selection effect. When this explained gender pay gap is negative, it corrects the gender pay gap upwards. So the unexplained results higher than the unadjusted. Now let's see in the next slide the different factors that are contributing to explaining the gap. So we have corrected with age, job experience, education, occupation, economic activity, working time, enterprise size, and the type of contract. If we look at all the factors, it is clear that economic activity plays an important role in explaining the gap. It is well known that women tend to concentrate on specific activities such as education or health with lower average earnings, while men concentrate in others such as finance or IT, which are more remunerative. Adjusting for this effect corrects the unadjusted gender pay gap downwards. Part-time work also explains a big part of the gap in some countries, Belgium, Austria, Germany, and to a lower extent, Netherlands and Italy. On the other hand, occupation and education are other factors that are explained in the gap, because normally women tend to have higher education levels and occupations on average. Adjusting for these effects corrects the unadjusted gender pay gap upwards. So moving to the next slide, the question is, should we use the gap after adjusting? Well, if we look at both indicators, the original one in blue and the unexplained after adjusting in orange, and how do they correlate with an indicator of socioeconomic development, such as the mean gross hourly earnings in purchasing power parities, we can see that the unadjusted explains almost nothing of the variance, only 2% of it, while the unexplained explains up to 44% of the variance of the behavior of the indicator. Therefore, we consider that the adjusted gender pay gap is more appropriate for cross-country comparisons. At least it corrects some of the compensation effects, and it's better aligned with other indicators of socioeconomic development. And now, in this last slide, we can see that we have three different groups of countries according to the gender pay gap after adjusting for the different characteristics. On the first stream, we have the countries with the lowest gender pay gap after adjusting, which are the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, complemented with Belgium and Cyprus. For these countries, the unadjusted gender pay gap is adjusted downwards. For these Nordic countries, the main driver is economic activity. For Belgium is part-time, for Cyprus is occupation, and Finland is not in this group because it starts from a higher unadjusted gender pay gap, but the adjustment is very similar to the rest of the Nordic countries. On the other stream, there are the majority of the Eastern countries, plus Ireland, Portugal, and Switzerland. The main drivers of this group is the size of the adjustment upwards. Among the Eastern countries, we can find two subgroups. While some start from a relatively high unadjusted gender pay gap, which is not compensated by the rather limited adjustment, some others are much adjusted upwards. Finally, after adjustment, we can ask ourselves if there are differences in the returns. So, as mentioned earlier, part of the unexplained gap is the difference in financial returns. When we talk about returns, for example, for age, we mean for every additional year of age, women earn X% less or more, while men earn Y% less or more. We identify that there are lower returns for women by age, and this could be explained by the impact of career breaks. Among the whole population of women, some interrupt their careers for childcare, and this pushes the average return downwards. On the other hand, women have high returns in the end of their careers compared with men, when they have probably less responsibilities out of work. Then their earnings partially catch up with those of men. And now I leave the floor to continue with other segregation effects to Danny.
Thank you, Marina. Good morning, everyone. So my colleague has explained how we correct for the different characteristics of male versus female employees, moving from the unadjusted gender pay gap to the unexplained part. And this is to approximate as much as possible the concept of unequal pay for equal work. However, there are other differences between men and women in the labor market. Women work more often part-time than men, and which has an impact on their monthly and annual earnings. In addition, women are also employed in lower proportion than men. So to capture all these effects together, Eurostat has developed a synthetic indicator which is called the gender overall earnings gap. At EU level, this indicator is 36%. It means that women of working age, be they employed, unemployed, or outside the labor market, they earn on average 36% less than men of working age. This figure varies from 20% in Lithuania to 44% in Austria and the Netherlands. This results from the combined effect of the employment rate, which is lower for women in general, part-time work, which is more prevalent among women, and the difference in the hourly earnings, which is captured through the unadjusted gender pay gap, as was analyzed before. So the gender overall earnings gap and its components shed light on the main drivers of the gender pension gap as well. So to conclude, I would say first that there is a clear interest in decomposing the unadjusted gender pay gap to identify, to measure, and to correct for composition effects. Second, gender pay gap adjustments and the resulting unexplained gender pay gap are necessary to understand important drivers of the unadjusted gender pay gap. Finally, the overall earnings gap is another important indicator to go beyond the unadjusted gender pay gap. It captures all effects that may have an impact on the average earnings of women of working age compared with men. If you are interested in more information, you can find the gender pay gap figures in Eurostat database and also in a Statistics Explained article, which is dedicated to gender pay gap statistics. In addition, full results have been published as a working paper together with tables for users. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Denis and Marina. We're now going to move on to a Q&A session. I'll remind you again that we're collecting the Q&A via Slido. So if you've got a question you want to pose, please place it in Slido. I will say that obviously Eurostat can only cover questions that are within Eurostat's responsibility. So questions on policy and are probably not for us, but questions around the data and the statistics and the number are. Now, for the Q&A session, we're being joined not just by the people you've already seen, by Christine, Denis, Marina and Genevieve. We're being joined by two other colleagues. We've got Didier Dupré, who is the head of unit for labour market statistics, and Fabienne Montagne, who is a team leader on the labour force survey as well. So we'll be looking at the questions. I'll try and distribute them fairly to people. If I make a mistake, you can signal to me, my dear colleagues, and I'll extend the answer. So the first question we've got is, are there any indicators that are missing? Referring to the two topics we selected. And I think Didier, I think Didier may say something about this.
Yes, thank you. Well, we presented here the really main headline indicators on this topic. We cannot say really that based on the statistic covered by Eurostat, we have a lot of other indicators. What is more interesting or more possible to use is further breakdowns, and it was a bit open by some of the presentation, as said by Genevieve. For the gender employment gap, there is also interesting effects on part-time, full-time, for example, which are not presented now, but that are available in our publication today. In the area of the gender pay gap, well, Denis presented also taking into account segregation effect, the overall, the gender overall earning gaps, which is an additional indicator, and it just presented. But what is clear, and it relates also to another question I have seen, is that we can only, for the part which is explained, take into account what we collect as information, and some elements are not collected in relation with earnings, such as care responsibilities. It is mentioned in one of the questions. So, of course, when we adjust the gender pay gap, it is adjusting as much as possible based on the information we have, but potentially further additional adjustment could be possible, but are not available in the EU sources, statistical sources in the domain. So, but largely we have already explained a lot, but still some elements remain. So the analysis can be always further improved, but either it is available already but not presented today, as I have mentioned for the part-time, or is not available at least yet today, but could be, of course, further analyzed in terms of gender pay gap, for example, taking into account the care of children or elderly. Thank you.
Thank you, Didier. Then we have a question: when it comes to gender in rural areas, what data is being collected? And I think Fabienne, I think, is the one to reply on that.
Yes, so first, good morning to everyone. Then in terms of gender statistics for rural area, I would like to say that Eurostat publish mainly two types of statistics. The first one is by degree of urbanization with three main categories, and one of these three categories is the rural areas. And we publish also statistics by by region, so by NUTS 2, even NUTS 3 for some of the statistics. So in NUTS 3 goes far in the details. All these statistics can be found on the Eurostat website, especially as regard labor force surveys. We have a lot of breakdowns and a lot of indicators broken down by NUTS 2 categories, and there you can really see what is the gender employment gap in your own region, if you are interested in.
Thank you, Fabienne. I think there you've also answered the next question, which was, do you have information about regions apart from member states? And I think, yes, you've answered that. Then we have a question: are women and men employed in EU institutions receiving equal pay for equal work? And I think there, Christine, perhaps you can answer that.
Well, yes, that's not really part of our statistics, but indeed the EU staff is employed under staff regulation, and there is no differentiation between men and women. So the answer to your question can be simply and shortly, yes, they are getting the same money for the same work.
Thank you, Christine. And then we have a question: are women and men of each country defined based on nationality, so accounting for working abroad, or based solely on employment within countries? And for those of us who work in the area, this is the domestic concept and the national concept. Fabienne, do you have an answer for this?
Yes, so in fact, what we presented today by country is based on the country of residence. So it includes all people living in the country, whatever their nationality or their citizenship is. But also on the Eurostat website, we have a specific data broken down by country of birth or by citizenship. But our main statistics only take the country of residence.
Thank you, Fabienne. Then we have a couple of questions that I suspect probably are more policy issues rather than Eurostat issues. I'll just mention them briefly. Women are at a disadvantage because they take more time off work, sick children care, for example. How can we decrease the effect of this in the gender pay gap? And I mean, unless one of my colleagues wants to interject, I would say what we do is we try to measure the effects that have an impact on the gender pay gap, but the policy for decreasing the impact of those effects is for others, not for Eurostat. We can provide the data on which policies can be devised. And there's a second one, what can be done to stop discrimination of women at the workplace related to promotions? where the point is made that this may require achievements in a period while during which women are doing most childcare. And again, that's a policy issue outside the remit of Eurostat, I think. Christine or Didier, I don't know if you want to say anything other than that. No, as I say, unfortunately, we cannot answer every single question. We can answer about the data, the numbers. So then we have one here. When talking about gender pay gap or gender employment gap, we refer to gap per hour, but what about annual figures? So, Denny, I think that one's for you.
Yes, indeed, I can answer for the gender pay gap, which is calculated based on hourly earnings indeed. The advantage is that this way we can capture both part-timers and full-timers. But yes, it also has a drawback in the sense that we measure it on an hourly basis, and then we miss the impact of the number of hours worked per month or per year, and then the monthly and the annual earnings impact. And this is exactly one reason why we have developed the gender overall earnings gap, where we take this into account. So we go beyond the gender pay gap, which is based on hourly earnings, to measure the difference in the annual earnings of all women of working age compared with all men of working age. Thank you.
Thank you, Denny. Then we have one which I think is for Marina, because I think it was part of your presentation, in fact. So does the gender pay gap take into account that there are jobs, occupations where mostly men or women are concerned?
Yes, indeed, it is part of the adjustment of the occupation gender segregation. So we include that, and is one of the main factors that is correcting normally for all the EU countries upwards. Yes, indeed.
And then question 13, can we find somewhere a list of what professions, types of contracts are taken into account for a given country when calculating the wage gap? So I suspect this refers to the details of the adjustment. So is this Marina or Denny who can answer this one?
Maybe I can try just to say that our calculation is based on all kinds of professions, all types of contracts. All employees are included in our calculation. Thank you.
And when you do the adjustment, how many different types of contract and profession do you take into account when you?
This may be for Marina, maybe.
Yes.
So we take into account two different types of contracts, the indefinite and the temporary.
Okay, and occupation is what? How many? What sort of level of breakdown of professions do you look at? Occupation.
We look at 2-digit level of the ISCO classification.
Which would be roughly how many?
40, I think.
Okay, so 40 different professions taken into account when we do the adjustment.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question. I saw a gender divide in STEM field. Again, it's a policy, perhaps it's a policy one. Is there any policy that encourage young girls and female workers to enter that field? There, I will say we did a news release fairly recently because there is an International Day of Women and Men in Science. So we do need, we do cover that with some of our data, but I think, Christine, again, policy, the policy for encouragement is outside our remit.
Yes, you're right. This is really to change things is not our task. What we do in Eurostat, as Tim said it, we measure, we provide evidence so that policymakers know where are pain points, where things have to be done, and then also to monitor the success of policies.
Okay, then there's another one. Does Eurostat plan on releasing an updated paper with more focus on gender employment in the EU? And could it be an annual report? I don't know if Didier or someone wants to talk a little bit about what we do publish regularly on gender employment issues, because we do have publications.
Yes, certainly. Well, actually, today or around today, there is a series of news release Statistics Explained which are published. So we every year at the opportunity of the Women's Day do this exercise. Whether we should have a systematic or a more systematic, we had also a publication last year on men and women, if I'm not wrong. So we can, of course, focus on having this regularly, but this should be, of course, discussed internally. But we do already quite a lot, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that available through the Eurostat website, you've got an interactive publication called The Life of Women and Men in Europe.
Yes, yes.
And this is updated every year. Every year, the latest year's data is added to the publication, and intermittently every few years, we give the publication a complete overview to see if there's new indicators or new fields to cover. So that interactive publication is one good starting point. And then, of course, there's Statistics Explained, which you can also find on our website, which where you'll find all our articles that we write in any area of statistics, but that includes gender statistics. Then question 6, the next question we've got, can you explain why there is a gender gap in salary for the same position? I think Denny or Marina, this is related to the adjustment, but also the fact that at the end of the day there is an unexplained.
Okay, I can answer maybe. So as was shown by Marina, there is a reminder. So after we adjust the gender pay gap for different occupations, different activities, part-time, full-time, different contracts, there is still a reminder. And this is what we call the unexplained gender pay gap. And how the label indicates, it means that we have not found statistical reasons from the data that we have to explain this reminder. So is this unequal pay for equal work? Is this caused by missing variables? Because we don't have all variables, especially on childcare, as Didier mentioned, or other dimensions of life. This remains unknown. We can only comment on the adjusted part, which was detailed by Marina.
Thank you, Denny. Then the next question, when analysing the effect of education, is it possible to separate STEM from other types of higher education for women and men? I think, Marina, this one possibly is for you.
Yes, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Is it possible, when you're looking at education levels, is it possible to separate STEM from other forms of higher education?
Currently in the adjustment, we are only taking into account at the aggregate levels for ISCED education. So we are not doing that level of detail. But at the point that we are able to explain, even if it's low, medium, or high, it's it has an effect on the adjustment. That is what we are doing currently because of sample size also.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question which I suspect it may be Fabienne, but we'll see. How do you define women and men? Is it based on sex recorded at birth? Is it self-declared gender identity or some other definition?
Yes, so we take the gender or the sex at birth for the moment, yes.
Okay, thank you. Then do you have gender pay gap data differentiated by public-private sector? So I think this one is for Marina because it's a separation issue within the data.
We correct for the enterprise control, whether it is public or private, but after correcting, we are not calculating one separately for those in private, those in public. it can be this study, it could be further even for age, for young people, but for the moment, this is what we have done.
Okay. And then we have a question, when will you have data for 2021 available? Fabienne, do you want, I mean, there's two issues here. There's the general availability of labour market data for 2021, and then there's also the calculation of the gender pay gap and so on for 2021. Fabienne, perhaps?
Yes, so I can start with the gender employment gap. So the data come from the Labour Force Survey. This survey is a quarterly survey, so we publish quarterly results. So the result for the quarters Q1, Q2 and Q3 of 2021 are already published. And what concerned the fourth quarter of 2021 plus the annual 2021 data will be published end of April. From mid of April for the quarterly and end of April for the annual 2021 data.
Thank you. And Denny or Marina, what about the gender pay gap? When will we next be in a...
For the unadjusted gender pay gap, we have annual data, which are released the beginning of March each year. So we have just released the data for 2020. And so in beginning of 2022, we will have data for 21. For the adjusted gender pay gap, it's a bit more tricky because it relies on a very rich source of data, which is structure of earnings survey, which is very costly and that we collect only every 4 years. So we'll have to wait a little bit more to have the new study on gender pay gap adjustment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then there's one for Marina, I think. Is the gender pay gap the same across economy sectors and company size? And again, I think that was part of your presentation.
Yeah, so as we have mentioned, we correct or we adjust by the segregation effects that could be hidden by sectors of economy. So we do that, and yeah, it's part of the adjustment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then there's another question that I suspect is more policy than statistics, which is how can you be sure that women and men get the same reward for the same work? It's our job to measure what the differences are, not to make sure that they get the same for the same work. That's other people's responsibility. Then part of the same question, did you check for differences in education age, parental leave and part-time? And there, Marina, I think the answer is largely yes.
Yes, also we corrected for part-time is part of the findings that we got. Yes, it plays a role indeed in this adjustment of the gender pay gap.
So yes, so all of those were they were taken, they're taken into account in the adjustment. Then, do you have data on employment gap between women and men broken down by the level of schooling? I think that was the employment gap was Genevieve, but did you present? I can't remember. So the level of schooling.
Actually, we release by the 3 levels of education, high, medium, and low. Now, for collecting the data, maybe Fabienne, if we can, I think we collect a little bit more. So Fabienne, if you want to take over the question.
Yes, so in fact, we collect the data with much more information. We don't publish everything on the website, but if you are interested, you can send an email to Eurostat, and we will provide you the data with more detail about the level of education if you are interested in.
Thank you. Then we've still got time, so we've still got questions coming in. So we have a question is there a significant gender difference in the contract type, indefinite and temporary? And does one gender have more of one type of contract than the other? So that was, again, Marina, I think that's part of your adjustment that you looked at the contract type.
Yes, we looked at the contract type, but maybe Danny can complement this part with the other statistics related.
Yes, indeed, women are more frequently having temporary contracts. So this also plays a role in the unadjusted gender pay gap, but we correct for it in the gender pay gap adjustment.
Yeah, and also, Fabienne, maybe Genevieve, I mean, from the employment statistics, can you say something about the difference in employment by contract type? Does that have a gender dimension, a distinct one?
Maybe I can start. For temporary, we know that actually there are many young people having this type of contract. So difference is larger for the age than for the sex, but we can. I would like just to say that for part-time, it is really clear the gender difference is very large, and it should be taken into account, of course. Maybe Fabienne, if you want to complement.
Yes, no, it's mainly that. So we see, of course, more women, especially like Genevieve said, across the among the part-time workers. Slightly more also women with temporary contract, but as Genevieve said, the biggest characteristic for the temporary contract are the young people.
Okay. Then we have a question for men and women who are not active in the labour market. Do you collect the reasons behind that? Is that for Fabienne, I believe?
Yes. Yes, so indeed, we call now these people people outside the labour force, and we collect them. We collect for them the main reason why they are not in the labour force, and so we have specific categories which have been harmonized starting from 1st of January 2021. So all the reasons have been harmonized, and we have some main breakdowns, and one of the breakdown is care responsibilities, and another one family responsibilities, which are also interesting for the topic of today.
Okay, thank you. Then we have one, I think, for Marina, on the age effects on the gender pay gap. Does the unexplained gender pay gap decline with age? Do you calculate the unexplained gender pay gap for different age brackets? So.
Yes, so before talking about the unexplained, indeed there is a clear relationship with age, between age and gender pay gap. And the youngest employees, the gender pay gap is lower and it starts increasing after 30 years old. For the unexplained, we haven't yet done this project. It will be very interesting, but we suspect it will have the same trend. That could be maybe explained by some reasons, such as in the labor market may have changed in time. So female employees, young female employees may not face the same handicaps as previous generations, older women that entered the labor market some decades ago. And also because women above 30 years old, as we have already mentioned, they face more caring responsibilities, they take career breaks, and then they result in higher gender pay gaps.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question. Do we have any information on the impact of the COVID crisis on the employment of women? Are there groups that have been more affected than others? Is this perhaps for Fabienne?
Yes, I can take this question. So as I mentioned just before, the labour force survey provides quarterly results. and it can help us to analyze the COVID crisis, the impact of the COVID crisis on employment. So if we look at the employment rate at EU level, we can see that between the first quarter and the second quarter of 2021, the employment rate for both women and men decreased by the same level, so around 2 percentage points for both women and men. And for both women and men, the employment rate was the lowest in the second quarter of 2020. So this is similar, but we can see some difference between men and women, especially as regards the recovery. So starting from the second quarter of 2021, and it continues in the third quarter of 2021, we see a recovery in the employment rate, and there it seems that the recovery is stronger for women than for men, because looking at the figure, we see that the recovery for women is about 1.9 percentage point, while for the men it's only, let's say only, but still is positive, a recovery from an increase of 1.4 percentage point. So looking at the result in the third quarter of 2021, we see a small decrease in the gender employment gap for the third quarter of 2021. Just maybe I can just add that we see, so behind this global figure at EU level, we see different impact for different subgroups. So we see that the young people were the most affected by the health crisis in terms of employment. And also, if we look more into the detail, we see that in particular, the women with a medium level of education were the most impacted by the COVID crisis.
Okay, so let me see if we're nearly at an end. We've nearly run out of time. I'm just seeing if there's one more, if there's one more quick question. I think, okay, I think we've covered most of them, and in case we've missed anybody, any questions, I would remind you that you can send questions to our support services from the Eurostat website. There you'll find links to contact us where you'll find our various support services, and you can send us a question if we've got if there's any that we haven't got round to, and we'll try our best to answer them. Then I have one more piece of bureaucracy to mention, that also on Slido we will be doing a quick questionnaire about the event, and we'd like you just to quickly answer, if you could, on Slido one or two questions about the event. We have other events coming up, further webinars coming. We're looking at the next one, I believe, is on Friday, when we will have a webinar on energy statistics, which are, of course, much in the news at the moment, and that will be again from 11 till 12 on Friday. And then the next one after that is transport statistics, which I think is planned for the 22nd of March. And I don't know if we've set a time for that one yet. My colleagues are prodding me. Oh, they're the 22nd of March. We're planning 10 till 11 for transport statistics. It just remains for me to thank all our panelists, our Director of Social Statistics, Christine, our Head of Unit for the Labour Market Statistics, Didier, team leaders, Denny and Fabienne, and statistical officers, Marina and Genevieve. Thank you all for your time and for answering the questions. And I hope that we've managed to interest you and explain some and help you understand some of these data better. So just thank you all, and thank the panelists, thank the audience. Thank you.